In this Adobe Illustrator CS6 demonstration, I'm going to introduce to you the differences between a vector graphic versus a bitmap graphic and what it means to rasterize a vector graphic. What's the difference between what is a raster? We're going to discuss what a vector graphic is. I'll talk to you about vectors, points, and Bezier curves. I'll introduce to you the idea of a bitmap image, and we'll look at an example of that. I'm going to import or place the bitmap into a new Illustrator project so you can see that they can be used in conjunction with vector graphics. And I will talk to you a little bit about the fact that Illustrator has the ability to trace bitmaps and convert them to vector when they're very uncomplicated bitmap images, and how you can take a vector graphic and Illustrator has the ability to actually rasterize the vector and create a bitmap from that. So you can go back and forth. So first of all, what is a vector graphic? A vector graphic is actually a mathematically calculated path that you can create very easily in Adobe Illustrator. In fact, Illustrator is very proud of the fact that it works very well with vector graphics, and that's why Illustrator is the choice for creating any type of graphic in which you need to be able to scale the image and use it in a variety of documents and presentations. For example, logos are very often created using Illustrator because a logo might have to appear in something as small as a business card to something as large as a giant outdoor sign. So these scalable graphics are mathematically calculated and they make very soft, smooth curves. Let me show you what I'm talking about. So you have a lot of drawing tools that we'll get into in a later demonstration in Illustrator to work with. Let's say I just want to create a basic rectangle here on my image window. And I'm going to use this control panel just to assign some sort of interesting colors for you to see this a little bit more easily. So I have this path here, and it's a familiar rectangle shape. But what happens if I zoom into this rectangle? What's really going on here? You can see that it's made up of a path or an outline, and that path has several key points along the way. And I can see those points by using my direct selection tool. If I click on the edge, or even if I hover on the edge of this rectangle, it lets me know that there's a point there. If I click on it, then it darkens that particular corner point and lets me know that this one is selected because the other ones remain that white point color. So the darkened one is the selected point. So all that a vector graphic is a series of points and lines that are connected to form a shape. You can also create a vector graphic using the pen tool, which we'll get into later and you'll work with extensively this term. But the pen tool actually you can click and drag across the image window here, and notice what happens as I'm making curves as I create this path. These curves are known as Bezier curves, and they are comprised of a point, an anchor point, and these handles or Bezier curve handles that allows us to manipulate that curve simply by clicking and dragging on those handles. So again, your computer is making thousands of calculations at one time as I manipulate these mathematically calculated curves. Okay, so this is a vector graphic. So let's zoom back out. And let's talk about a bitmap image. So you've looked at a vector path, you've looked at Bezier curves. What's the difference between this vector graphic and a bitmap? Well, I'm going to switch over to Adobe Photoshop to illustrate my point. Photoshop is really the premier software program for manipulating bitmaps and editing bitmaps. So here's a photograph that I've got. And if I wanted to investigate this lunar eclipse and I wanted to take a look at the sliver of the moon, if I zoom in closer, 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 you begin to see that this bitmap is comprised of thousands of tiny squares, and these tiny squares are called pixels. And the pixels are what make up a bitmap image. Thousands and thousands of pixels. Pixel depth refers to the size of that image. So the more pixels that you have per square inch determines the refinement or how smooth the image is. Now this image is rather pixelated, which means that it's a very low resolution image. This image might be something that you could display on a web page, but not something that you would use for print. So that's a bitmap image. I'm going to close this image in Photoshop. Let's say I'm done manipulating it. And if I wanted to use it in an Illustrator project, I could maybe start a new Illustrator project. We'll just use the default settings for letter using the unit of inches and click OK. And now I'm going to place this bitmap into my project. So under File, I can place this bitmap. And notice how Illustrator handles the bitmap. It shows me that it's this object here on my artboard. If I use the selection tool, I can select that bitmap and move it around my image window. And yet, we all know that this is not a vector graphic, and it is comprised of all of those little pixels as opposed to our mathematically calculated, scalable vector. The other key point about vectors, let me copy this, and I'm going to paste it here in our image window next to the bitmap. No matter what size I scale this vector graphic, it still appears smooth in the image window. If I zoom in closer, 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 closer to this vector graphic, you can see that it is still smooth and we don't see those pixels. We don't see those little tiny squares. So that's another differentiation between vector and bitmap, is that the vector graphic is scalable, which is why it's extremely handy for creating logo types or postcards or things that are going to be used in print that may have to be used over and over again in a variety of places, outputs, and in different scale. So vector graphics are really handy. So you can import and place bitmaps in Illustrator. You can also trace bitmaps and convert them to vector graphics, but you can, by contrast, you can rasterize a vector. So let's go back to our little project here. I can take, let's maybe type some text here. And let's make it a size that you can actually see. I'm going to select that text. I'm going to use this control panel to just make it a larger size that you can actually see. Maybe make it a bold. So if I have this sample text and I'm going to convert this sample text to a vector graphic. So under type, I'm going to create outlines. I now have this scalable vector text, and it's made up of many, many points because there are so many potential points within the type These letter forms have a lot of points. Now if I want to select this object on my artboard, I can actually rasterize it and convert this text into something very similar to this bitmap or photograph. And I simply do that going under Object and Rasterize. So we'll go into this in more detail in a later demonstration, but I just wanted you to know that you can take things and go both directions in Illustrator. At this point, it's kind of interesting to know that you can export these objects back and forth. And now if I zoom in, you start to see some jaggy edges on the side of that text. And you can see the pixelation that occurs when this text object that started out as a vector has been now converted. That started out as a vector has been converted to a bitmap, as we can see the pixelation here. Can you go the other direction? Indeed you can. So what if you started out with a bitmap? Illustrator also has something that we'll go into more detail later, the ability to actually trace an image and convert it the other direction. So if I choose maybe a tracing preset, maybe we're working on line art or a black and white logo, Illustrator can trace it, and if I like what I see in this sample, I can click expand and it converts it back into this vector graphic, which we can see by zooming in. We have those points again that we can select along the letter forms. And this concludes the demonstration on what is the difference between a vector and a bitmap, and how does Adobe Illustrator CS6 handle both of these types of graphics.